All right, everybody, welcome. Creation episode number 8, I believe. We're getting into the actual flood and some of the details. We're going to be here for at least the next 2, maybe 3 episodes. There's actually a lot of detail that we need to cover in regards to the flood, proof of the flood, um, things like that I really want to get into. So, last week what did we do last week? Last week we talked about uh, the idea that God, you know, He was going to ruin creation, His creation. He was going to ruin the thing He loved, and it pained Him and it hurt Him. And we also talked about the details of the size of the ark. And if you remember, we talked about kinds a little bit, but we reflected back on the earlier episode about kind. So if you're jumping in now and haven't seen the other episodes, I would recommend you go back and start at number 1, because if you jump in here, you're going to be missing some detail that really lends to accepting the creation model as is written in the Bible, which is what we're after. So tonight we're going to start, I think it's Genesis 6 or Genesis 7. Genesis 6 is where we're starting tonight, chapter 7. We're going through 24. We're going to cover a whole bunch of different stuff here. Um, this is the stuff that I find fascinating. Next week, we're going to get into rock formations and fossils. Maybe I'll get into fossils a little bit then. And next couple episodes, we're going to talk about proof of dinosaurs existing while humans existed, which is absolutely one of my favorite subtopics of creation. But tonight we're going to talk about the water, where the water came from, how did Noah live for 900 years when we only live for 100 at best. And we're going to talk about God's hand in all of this. I've stated before many times that one of the things that bothers me is we attribute the miracles of God to people, and I don't like that. I'm not a fan of that. It takes away from what God is doing and gives that status to people, and that just doesn't seem right. So we call this Noah's flood. It's not Noah's flood, it's God's flood. It's not Noah's ark, it's God's ark. God told Noah how to build it, gave him specific instructions with dimensions and stuff. And then, we in Sunday school for little kids, we always teach, we show Noah, standing outside the ark, corralling animals in and counting them on a clipboard sort of thing, 2 by 2 and 7 by 7 or whatever. And none of those things happened. So that I want to focus on because I think is very important. Because if you don't, the crazy thing is we as human beings, we attribute our power to things that belong to God, and in doing so, we then move forward and deny things that He does on such a level that we remove His ability to be the omnipotent being that He is. And I know I'm kind of talking in big words here, but this is a big idea. And that is, like, we explain stuff away. So when you read the Bible and you read about the flood, a lot of people like to either treat the flood as though it never happened, that it's just a great story to learn a lesson from, or that it happened, but it happened on a small scale. And then there's, some confusion because there's a lot of different cultures and stuff that mention the flood, but then we use man's timeline to justify those cultures to say that they were around, before the flood that's in the Bible, but they couldn't have been around before the floods in the Bible because the flood that is in the Bible destroyed all life on earth except for those that were in the ark. So as the people dispersed and they created their own cultures, some of them would have left God and gone to new religions. They would have repeated these stories, or these events, should I say properly. They would have repeated these events that these floods have taken place. So in studying creation, if you're going to be honest about it, there are a few things that you cannot just assume. One of them is we do not know the timeline of the Earth. Period. There's no way to prove it. Um, it doesn't matter what you come at me with. There is no way to prove the age of the Earth. Number two, we have no way to prove what the Earth looked like before the flood. If Earth has always looked like it does today, I don't believe it has. We have evidence of that. And then the other thing is we don't know the composition of the atmosphere prior, and we don't know the composition of the Earth now. And I'm going to show you that tonight. So if you're going to approach creation in an honest way, you have to completely remove all of the things that man has assigned to you that have been taken over, that were given to us by God, right? So uh, he brought the animals to the ark. He created the flood. This is all his creation. He wiped it clean and started over again. And that has to be the premise that we come at when we're reading this. So that being said, let's get into it. So we'll start out in verse 6, like I said before. It says, "Now Noah was 600 years old when the flood of water came upon the earth." So here we start, and we already have a problem. How do people live 600 years? How do people live 950 years, I think, which is how old Noah was when he died, somewhere around there. He was over 900. And today, we struggle to make 80 or 90. Well, there's a couple factors that take place. One is genetic fault, right? So our genes are slowly falling apart. The earth is in decay. Part that is because of original sin. But, the further we progress down the timeline, the worse our genetics become. That's a minor part of it. The major part is the composition of the earth. So there's this science can be used to prove God, to prove events that God did, and science can also be used to disprove, right? And it depends on how you want to use science as a tool. So what I like to do is I like to use science that parallels the Bible. And that is not cherry picking. That is aligning with things in the Bible that science has proven, and I will use those as facts. People can come at me with stuff that shows otherwise, but oftentimes that proof is rather flimsy, such as the ability to age rocks or the radioisotope dating, which is full of holes and guesstimations. Any carbon life form we think we can date, and you actually can't. But the idea for us of people living 600 years, you're like, there's no way. I mean, how is that possible? So I want to show you something that I think is kind of cool on your screen here, if I can get this thing to work. So this is from ncsu.edu. It's just a picture of amber. Amber is basically tree sap that kind of froze solid, or however you want to term it, hardened. And in there, we often find insects, mosquitoes, flies, whatever. They found some cool stuff in amber before. What is in this piece of amber that's on your screen is not important because it's with any piece of amber. So in these older pieces of amber that survived the flood, there happens to be oftentimes air bubbles in them. Those air bubbles inside of the amber are resting in the exact phase that they were in when they were solidified in the amber. So what we basically have is a snapshot of the atmosphere that amber was formed in. Now, some of the oldest amber that we found that have air bubbles in it, their air bubbles are big enough that we can not only measure the pressure of the air bubble, but the contents inside. And what we find is that Earth, when the amber was formed, some of this older amber was formed, Earth had an oxygen level that was 35%. Currently, right now, it sits at about 21%, 21%, somewhere around there. It was at 35%, and the atmospheric pressure was higher. Now, This all becomes important because if we raise our atmospheric pressure and raise the oxygen level of the air that we breathe on a regular basis, one thing happens. We increase our longevity multiple times. So if we just take this piece of amber and we say, okay, with what we know are the contents of this amber, people could easily live 600 years, assuming their genetic material was a little cleaner than ours, not as damaged, and the pressure was as high as they think it was in these amber samples, and the oxygen level was as high as it measures in these amber samples, then we can easily look and see in verse 6, Noah was 600 years old when the floodwater came. And the reason why he was 600 years old when the floodwater came was because the earth was completely different than it is now, which again points to exactly what the scripture tells us. God destroyed the earth with the flood. He didn't annihilate it as in remove it from existence, but he destroyed it. He completely changed everything. Verse 7. Then Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him entered the ark because of the water of the flood. So remember, God gave him a warning. He said, look, in 7 days, stuff's going to start happening. And this is the end of the 7 days here. So the floodwaters start rising. So it hasn't started raining yet. The water is just rising. And Noah and his family get in the ark. So we haven't read anything about animals getting in the ark yet. We've just read Noah's instructions to prepare for 2 of certain kind of animals and 7 pair of certain other kind of animals. So he had to go through the preparation of collecting food and, I guess, building rooms or cells or cages or however you want to term it. I would think they would just be rooms, right? Animals didn't eat each other then. There was no meat eating going on. Everything was vegetarian, as we discussed in earlier episodes. So then we see this thing that Noah and his family entered the ark before the animals. And the reason why I focus on this is because if you look at the flood from a logical perspective, how could Noah build a giant boat? I mean, remember from last episode how big the boat was. How could he build a giant boat and travel all around the world collecting animals? Well, the answer is simple. He didn't collect the animals. God did. So from a logical perspective, you can then drop off one of the things that causes you not to believe the truth that's in Scripture. So Noah didn't have to collect the animals, right? Verse 8, it says, of clean animals and animals that are not clean, and birds and everything that creeps on the ground, there went into the ark to Noah by twos, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. Right? So the animals went to Noah in the ark. He was already in the ark. The animals went to him. God commanded them. God commanded Noah to build the ark. There is no difference from a command given to a dolphin and a command given to a human. The thing is the dolphin's more likely to listen than the human being. Not that dolphins were in the ark. I don't want to confuse anybody. Verse 9, there went into the ark. Oh, I read that, sorry. Verse 10, it came about after the 7 days that the water of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. So there's a couple events taking place here in verse 11. One is we have a specific date. Now, the fascinating thing about this is we have lost so much history that we no longer are able to properly calculate the date because of various calendar changes and Roman emperors and English kings and all sorts of nonsense that has taken place, that we can't pin down the exact day and month that the flood took place, but we can pin down the year. So the calendar date that we point to is 2472 BC. Now, BC stands for before Christ, but Christ was actually born on 2 BC, right? So basically, we need to add 2 calendar years to our current calendar year to have an understanding of how long ago the flood was. So right now we think it's 2021 when this is filmed, when you're watching it. Um, it's actually 2023 by BC standards. So the flood was 2472 BC. So 2,472 years before the birth of Christ. Now, the fascinating thing about this is you say, well, how has the entire earth repopulated and all this vegetation grown and all of these people come out of Noah's Ark in 4,000 years? Well, we're going to cover part of that next week. I'm going to leave you a little cliffhanger there. But so we have the thing I like about this is read this one more time. It says, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, right? So we have a specific day. It's the 17th of a specific month. See, that's the thing about Scripture, is God leaves very little to doubt. And one of the things that catches me here as we go through the Scripture tonight is I want you to think about how many times birds are mentioned. And the reason why this is important, I'll tell you in a minute, but it has to do with God giving you detail that we refuse to read in Scripture. Right? So then we get this last little part of verse 11. It says, fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. So if you remember from our previous discussions, it doesn't rain. What happens is the atmosphere is a little bit different. It's full of water, and a mist kind of settles on the ground every night. And then another thing that happens is water kind of comes up out of the ground to water everything. And if you think about this from a logical point of view, it kind of makes sense. We don't think of rain as sin because that's kind of silly, right? But it is. If you think of the act of rain, it is kind of a punishment. And I'm not talking about you just getting your hair wet, but with rain, we have hurricanes, we have lightning, we have thunder, we have floods, we have flash floods, we have mudslides, we have tornadoes, right? All of these things come out of a weather event that didn't exist pre-flood because the evil had not been fully allowed, I guess, and the punishment of God had not been fully given yet, right? So the flood marks what I think is biblically the first time it rained. I could be wrong about that, and I'm fine with being wrong about it, but there's no term for rain in the Bible other than it says there. The only time it mentions it before where we're at is it says it has not yet rained. And so, from a human being point of view, we know what rain is. There's no mention of it until now. And then there's mention of it in the Bible. There's floods and all sorts of catastrophes that happen because of rain. So I take the stance that it hadn't rained yet. And one of the reasons why that's important is because you go back to the composition of the atmosphere, right? The atmosphere would have been very dense with moisture and very dense with oxygen. And obviously, the formation of water is hydrogen and oxygen bonding together. So the atmosphere would have been very thick with that, which would have raised the atmospheric pressure and also raised the oxygen level on Earth. So no rain would have fallen. The other thing we get is fountains of the great deep burst open. The crazy thing is the fountains of the great deep that we know of today, which are under ocean vents, we didn't even know existed until the 1970s. So you're reading stuff in Scripture that human beings didn't think existed until 50 years ago. And that's a big deal to me. So if we think we're so smart and we think we've got everything figured out, we didn't know that there were underground water fountains, I'm going to call them, right, for lack of a better term. We didn't know they existed until about 50 years ago, give or take. And we actually got our first picture of one with a submarine ROV. So I want to show you what we kind of think the construction of the earth was. And if you remember from last episode, we talked about Pangaea, right? And again, this messes with your brain because you have to think from the point of view that everything on earth changed. Nothing is how it is now. The the destruction of earth means that everything was rearranged. So I'm gonna show you this picture. You've seen this before. This is Pangaea, right? And this image is a nice clean one, and I took it from genesispark.com. I hope they don't mind. Um, Everything was all kind of one landmass, all scrunched together. And then the crazy thing is you see the water vapor canopy around the earth, right? So the earth had this very thick, very heavy water vapor canopy. And that is where the rain came from when God let it rain. And that is what has changed in our atmosphere that reduced the oxygen level and reduced the pressure. So you see that here simulated on your screen. And then we have Pangaea, right? One large landmass, which when the fountains of the deep broke open, they split all the land masses apart. That's a pretty good picture of kind of how they go together um, in pretty good detail. It probably fit a little bit better than that, right? But with erosion and all sorts of things that took place when this mass quantity of water came up out of the ground, it would have completely changed how things look. In verse 12, it says, then rain fell upon the earth for 4 days and 40 nights. So it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but it actually flooded for 150 days. In verse 13, on the very same day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, sons of Noah and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast after its kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, all sorts of birds. Why does God keep mentioning birds in Scripture? In the story of the flood, why is it so important that every couple of verses God says, the birds were on the ark? The birds were on the ark. The reason for that, again, is this attention to detail. Where do birds live? They live on land. Okay? There's very few birds that live out in the ocean and never touch land. Almost none. All birds have to land somewhere. There are a few birds, very few, there are a few birds that land on water and live on water and never touch land. The majority of probably 98%, I'm making that up off the top of my head, almost all birds live on land. The reason why God keeps talking about the birds is because he wants you to understand that when he floods the earth, there is no land left anywhere. It is a global flood. And the reason why this is so important is because you understand that he is wiping every living thing off of the earth, off of the ground. Everything that lives on the ground is wiped out. What did not go on the ark died. Human beings, centipedes, kangaroos, elephants, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, hippopotamuses, doves, ravens, right? Whatever didn't make it on the ark was killed, completely wiped off of the face of the earth. Verse 15, it says, so they went into the ark to Noah, right? Again, to Noah. Noah didn't bring them into the ark, they went to him. By twos of all flesh, in which was the breath of life. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him, and the Lord closed it behind him. So again, we have this interesting detail that I find fascinating, and that is God shut the door to the ark. Now, why is this so important? Well, it's important because if you look at the size of the ark, which I didn't keep the pictures from last week, and I'm very sorry about that. I should have put the ark back up here. But how could Noah get back in? How could he shut the door and get in the ark? You see, the thing was built to protect the things inside of it so that nothing on the outside could get in. Now, why is this important? Well, if you think Noah probably didn't live in the middle of nowhere, he probably lived in a place where there were other people. As he was building the ark, there was probably some discussion about how he was crazy and why was he building this giant boat and what was going on. And as the floodwater would have started rising, people would have wanted to get on the boat, right? And even after the floodwaters rose to the point the boat was floating, if anybody was surviving by, floating on a broken tree or some piece of debris or just a really good swimmer, and the boat came by, they'd be able to get on the boat. And if they could get on the boat, then that would break God's rule of what he was trying to do, which was wipe everybody off the earth that was not worthy. Noah was the only one, Noah and his family were the only ones that were allowed to survive because they were the only ones who were willing to submit to God's will. Nobody else could survive. Therefore, Noah could not close the door on the ark because if he did, that means there would have been a way in and other people could have gotten on the ark. See, tiny detail that has huge consequences. So God shut the door on the ark. God led the animals to and into the ark to Noah, and maybe Noah shushed them in the direction he wanted them to go, or just let them walk or wherever. Maybe he said hi to all of them and petted each one as they came on. It doesn't matter. The idea is that Noah is passive here and God is the one active. 17. Then the flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. The water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Okay, here we go again. So Mount Everest, yes, Mount Everest. Mount Everest, no. What am I saying? We can go with Mount Everest. Mount Everest is a tall mountain, right? There's no way that there's enough water to reach the top of Mount Everest. That would be nuts. So where, how, what, right? There's a problem, isn't there? And you start to question things. Well, remember, the earth wasn't in the form it's in now. We don't know how tall the mountains were. And we're gonna make a logical, educated guess that the mountains weren't as tall as they are now. And the reason why we can make that guess, which I'm going to show you next week in detail, is because we find fossils and seashells at the top of mountains all the time. In fact, even where I live, which is, I believe, about 110 miles from actual coastline, I can dig on my property and dig up shells, seashells from the ocean, right? How did they get here? But we often find marine life at the top of mountains that there could never, ever been marine life there. So that points to the idea that the mountains weren't ever really that tall before, and they are now, and that's part of the destruction of Earth. You say, well, that's convenient. What a way to kind of, explain things away. Well, there's this crazy thing that has really kind of upset the apple cart here. And it came out very recently. And it's this, I can't remember the name of the actual Ridgewood. I think it's called, I look like an idiot here. I think it's Ridgewood light. It's a type of mineral, and it's only formed in water. but it's only formed in water from the middle of the crust of, or the middle of the mantle of Earth. So if we think of Earth, right, we have a crust around the top. The oceans sit on the crust, and then below the crust we have the upper mantle, and then the lower mantle, and then the outer core, and then the inner core. And in the inner core, we think is molten iron, and the outer core is, I think, molten nickel, possibly. And then there's all the molten rock, and then there's kind of tarry like, kind of asphalty kind of rock in the outer layer below the crust. And in that layer is where this Ridgewood mineral is made. The crazy thing is this diamond popped up in Brazil. And if you look at it, it's not a very pretty diamond by any stretch. Um, but it has this Ridgewood mineral in it. And the only way it could have been formed is if there were huge quantities of water in this layer. And so scientists have done all kinds of research and stuff. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, we're finding out, because of this diamond that has this inclusion in it, we're finding out that there's water down where we didn't think there was water before, where we think it's just rock. And so this is the picture that they've come up with. And if you look at this, it's pretty impressive, right? I got this from sciencetimes.com. The little gold kind of bar looking thing, that would be what we know as continental ridge. And then the ocean would be covering over that. And that thin layer where the continental ridge is, that's the crust of the earth. And then if you look and you see that, kind of like the blue stuff, right? The blue stuff is water underneath the crust in this outer mantle layer. And it's kind of poking up in that ridge. Well, there's one of the fountains of the deep. That's where that under the crust ocean, so the ocean under the ocean, actually penetrates our crust and oftentimes comes out. And there's places where our ocean pours in. Well, they've done some math and some estimates upon this finding, and there's actually enough water down in this layer that is underneath our ocean that could flood the earth currently completely. There's more water there than there is on earth above the crust. So just that little bit of detail there, them finding this diamond that had this inclusion in it, some kind of mineral that's only formed in the mantle layer that has to have water. And then because it's inside of a diamond, the only place that diamonds are made, we know where they're made. And so it comes up somehow through one of these ridge vents somewhere, ends up in Brazil in the soil. Somebody digs it up. And all of a sudden, we now have brand new proof this decade of the fact that there's more water on Earth than we ever had any idea. So when you combine the change in the atmosphere, the water vapor that was stored in the atmosphere in this image here, with the water that is stored in this image here, we can flood the whole entire Earth without an issue. So that's where the water came from. I love that as we, nobody correlates this stuff backwards. We're just like, oh, look what we found. Well, everything refers back to the scripture that we're reading. When are we going to realize maybe there's other things that are right or wrong about what we think that are included, because we're not focused on scripture anymore, because we've treated this book with such hatred and such denial for so long. And the longer we go and the more discoveries we make, the more we find that the things in this book are absolutely true. And here we found something, within the last decade that again goes back to prove that the entire earth could have been flooded at some point. Verse 20 says, the water prevailed 15 cubits higher and the mountains were covered. So 15 cubits, what is that? 20 some odd feet, 22, 23 feet. So the ark, we estimate, we try to estimate the draft. It would have cleared with 22 feet of, of water between the top of the highest mountain on earth at that time. The ark would have been able to float over it. So we know that the earth was completely changed. It's not in the format that it's in now. We know that happened. Regardless if you want to attribute it to the flood or you want to attribute it to 4 billion years of continents creeping apart or whatever you want to do, we know for a fact that the earth has not been how it is now. We know for a scientific fact that there is enough water to flood the entire earth. We know for a scientific fact that the atmospheric conditions on earth have changed dramatically, that the moisture level, the pressure, and the oxygen level have all been reduced drastically, which has an immediate impact on our longevity. And then in scripture, we know by reading that Noah wasn't responsible for collecting all the animals or making them show up or even getting them into the ark. And we know for a fact that Noah didn't have to close the door, which seems like such a small detail, but all of a sudden you start to understand the importance. This thing's not so far-fetched, is it? Verse 21, all flesh that moved on the earth perished. All flesh that moved on the earth, right? So remember, we didn't have aquariums in the ark. Noah wasn't worried about the swimmies, right? Anything that swam could have survived somehow, some way. Also, again, we don't know the composition of water prior to the flood. We don't know if there were oceans. We don't know if they were salty. We have no idea, right? All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth and all mankind. Everything gone. Verse 22, of all that was on dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life died. Everything's gone. The only civilization that exists after the flood is Noah and his family. So you know how we have like the Mayans. The Mayans were this ancient culture. They had the end calendar of 2012. Whoops. They were advanced. Where did they go? What happened to them? They were post-flood. Because we wouldn't have the temples and the structures that exist today because the flood would have wiped them out. The entire earth was destroyed. Right? Now, what we do have, which is crazy, is like, I think it's 99.2. I'm going to look that up next week. I'm going to be sure about this, but I know it's around 99% of all fossils found are found in the same layer. If that's the case, how did they all get there, right? Easy. There was a catastrophic event on Earth where all life died. Those few bones that made it, that were fossilized or were somehow saved in mud or whatever, those few specimens that we found are all in the same layer, all throughout the entire Earth. Same geological layer, right? Again, more proof of a flood. So anything that didn't make it on the ark died. And I know I keep repeating that, but you have to understand that just because God commanded an animal doesn't mean the animal listened. So there may have been animals that existed pre-flood that don't exist post-flood. The animals that did make it on the ark, right, post-flood, may have not regenerated quickly enough to survive, or may have been hunted out of existence. We know animals were hunted out of existence. The woolly mammoth was one of them. The buffalo, the bison, right? There are no buffalo anymore. We only have bison. And one of the reasons of that is because the buffalo were wiped out and we crossbred to get back to as close as we can to a buffalo. That's what a bison is. That's my understanding of it. It could be wrong. The dodo bird. Apparently they were good eating and easy to catch because they couldn't fly. They don't exist anymore. That was in the past century that happened. So there's huge ramifications that take place and a huge set of things that affect our history. And so, a lot of people, they talk about like, well, I mean, how did dinosaurs get on the ark? I mean, how could a T-Rex be on the ark? Well, number one, a T-Rex ate salad back then. And number two, a baby T-Rex wouldn't have been that big, right? And maybe instead of an actual T-Rex, maybe it was just T-Rex eggs that made it on the ark. And things like, the elephant. It would have been a young elephant. It wouldn't have been an old adult. It would have been a young adult that was the age of reproduction that would have had the longest time span possible to be able to reproduce and proliferate on the earth again. So all animals are gone. The only animals that exist are on the ark. Now, the striking thing is we get hung up on animals, right? We love to think about animals. Human beings love animals. The only people that existed on the entire face of the earth were Noah, his 3 sons, his wife, and his 3 sons' wives. That was it. No other people existed on the entire planet. Next week, I'm going to show you how that's possible in numbers. Not the book of numbers, like Excel numbers. Verse 23 says, thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky. They were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left together with those that were with him in the ark. And then we have this word prevailed again in verse 24, which is where we're stopping for tonight. The water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Okay, the word prevailed is extremely important. Prevailed means overcome. So you've got to think, I want to cover this next week. I don't want to get into it too much this week, but I want to finish here. If you think of fountains bursting open and a floodgate kind of being unleashed on earth, right? Water is going to constantly be coming and going. There's going to be tidal waves. There's going to be huge currents that are going to kind of move around, right? So for 150 days, everything on earth is basically rearranged, like chairs on the deck of the Titanic. There is nothing left standing that stood, nothing at all. Everything is laid flat, laid clean. And that destruction lasted for 150 days while this cork that we call the ark bobbed up and down on that water and kept 8 people alive and all the animals that now we know exist. Pretty interesting stuff. We'll get into the proof of what took place next week. So this week we focused on how, right? How it could have happened, why it would have happened. Next week we're going to focus on proof that it did happen. And I'm going to start with people, and we're going to get into animals. And this is going to go on for a couple weeks, so get ready for a lot more pictures than we have now. Get ready for fossils. If you like fossils, you like dinosaurs, you like artwork, It's going to be some good stuff coming up. We're going to prove to you that the flood happened. Hope you enjoyed tonight. That was episode 8. Episode 9 coming next week. Love to see you then through the camera. For those of you who are in the Reedsville, Georgia area and attend church, our church is opening back up March 7th. That is a firm date now. March 7th, the church will be back open for live services. So if you feel inclined, please show up. Otherwise, live services will always be streaming on YouTube. Everybody have a great night. Have a great rest of the week. Remember, I love you. This guy loves you way more than me. Live for him. And I will see you all next time.